Welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. We continue today part 2 of Battle of Stalingrad. Just to remind you that in the first part we dealt with the German offensive, which resumes in the spring of 1942 after Germans have recovered from the Battle of Moscow and the warm winter weather settles in, and they have begun their offensive. It's quite successful. They're moving all across Ukraine, from eastern Ukraine in the vicinity of Kharkov, and then they take Voronezh, and then they're on the way to Stalingrad, and they do come to Stalingrad at the end of August. And here is the official beginning of the Battle of Stalingrad. Why is that official beginning? Because here we have the actual battle in the city itself. The unique thing about the city is that in the Battle of Moscow, the battle never got anywhere close to Moscow. In the Battle of Leningrad, the front stabilized 5 kilometers to 10 kilometers before the city, and the Germans were just shelling it and starving the city. In Stalingrad, you actually have street fighting, corner after corner, building after building. It is absolutely astounding, 2 months long, intense fighting with hundreds of thousands of men on both sides dying in this battle. So from that point of view, the Battle of Stalingrad is unique urban warfare of modern times. So, as I said before, the 14th Panzer Corps reaches Stalingrad, and the city fights back. It's interesting that Stalin gave an order not to evacuate civilians, perhaps because he needed them to continue to work in the factories. And one of the most important factory, the Stalingrad tractor factory that produced tanks, T-44, it continued to work. In fact, it continued to turn out tanks until the very last day when the Germans burst into the factory. So the city continued to produce. Now, another important point about the Battle of Stalingrad is that it suffered enormous bombardment, probably worse than any other city, including Dresden and including London. There were 1,000 tons of bombs that were dropped over the city in just 48 hours. The city was basically completely destroyed. There were just ruins, and it was. But the Russians didn't give up. They just made fortresses out of each ruined city, and there were teams of snipers and units that would actually fight corner from corner, building to building, in the fiercest fighting of World War II. So the casualties were absolutely astronomical. Just on the beginning of the battle, 200,000 Russian troops died in the fighting on the approaches to the city, and then hundreds thousands more as the city was fighting these street battles with one unit after another wiped out. The statistics is absolutely astronomical. 80%, 90% of units were wiped out in this street fighting. The sad reality is that by February 43, which is when the battle is over, there's only 50,000 civilians left in the city. Many of the civilians joined the militia, joined the anti-aircraft units, and so forth. And one of the interesting facts is that when the Germans burst into the city, the first unit that they encountered was the anti-aircraft unit that put up a heroic fight, and they were astonished to find out that this was a women's detachment. It was completely staffed by women who put up an incredible fight to the last person. So 90% of the buildings in Stalingrad were completely destroyed. In any case, so this is the beginning at the last days of August, and in September, all of September and all of October, there's fierce street fighting going on. On September 2nd, the north and south of the city finally were taken by the Panzer Army, so the Germans reached the Volga River on both north and south of the city, and essentially now it was a matter of what they call mopping up, or street fighting to establish total control over the city, which took them 2 months. And this is again extraordinary, important, because of the winter that is coming. So the entire September and the entire November, street fighting is going on. The rail station passed from one side to another 10 times. The Malachov Kurgan is the beautiful hill in Stalingrad that today has a very impressive monument to the defenders of the city. It suffered one of the most vicious fighting in this war. Another new element in here was that you had snipers, and they would just establish themselves in these ruined buildings and just keep on shooting randomly at soldiers passing by, and this inflicted enormous casualties on the Germans. So the statistics is that the Germans in 42 lost several 100,000 men. It was much worse than 41, and even then they lost 150,000 by official count, but maybe more in terms of wounded and frostbites. But how now the casualties run into hundreds of thousands. Also, their air force, even though they're still preponderant, they still control the skies, but their air force suffered enormous losses. So in July 42, the Germans had 1,600 aircraft, and in November, after the major fighting was done, there's only 550 remaining, and that is a loss of 40%. This is not amazing. I mean, it is fighting and they lose aircraft. What I find most amazing is that by the beginning of winter, the Russians actually managed to produce more aircraft than the Germans, and they're beginning to take their own and have a preponderance in the skies over the Germans. So this is again another example how the Russians aircraft are complicated machines. It's not so easy to produce them in great numbers, and the Russians do begin to outnumber not only in tanks but also in aircraft. So from August to November, which is the core of the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans lost 60,000 troops, and this was 250,000, or close to 300,000 that began the advance. To sum up, by the end of November, it's beginning to look like the offensive fizzled out. It's just, you cannot sustain that kind of fighting and that kind of casualties for a considerable period of time. The second problem is that the separation between the army of the Caucasus and army of the Volga of the Germans is so wide that now it's virtually impossible for them to even establish contact. And third, and the most important thing, is that the Russians are preparing their offensive. They're quietly building up the reserves. They're pulling the Siberian troops, and they're going to strike back exactly as they did in winter a year ago around Moscow. What's so interesting about this offensive, which we're going to talk about in the next video, is that the Germans were not aware of it. They did not have a reliable intelligence to identify when and if the Russians are going to counterattack, and so they were caught unprepared. And now we're going to close at this point and face in the next video the actual Russian counteroffensive that would turn the fate of World War II into a routing defeat of Germany. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe. Short, concise, precise, entertaining videos. Thank you.